Welcome back. We're picking up where we left off. Today, we are initiating a distinct structural exploration into First Chronicles chapters 1 through 9.
Right, and this is going to be the first segment of a four-part arc. We're going to cover the entirety of the Chronicles material over these 4 sessions.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we do have a pretty precise agenda. First, we will establish a historical reconstruction of Persian period Yehud. We really need to ground ourselves in the actual world of the writer.
Because that world differs substantially from the Golden Age world that the text often depicts.
Yeah, that's a vital distinction. So, second, we will pivot to the analytical questions raised by the presence of these opening genealogies.
And then third, we'll get into a full thematic section on the literary operation of the text. So specifically examining how the writer functions as an inner biblical exegete.
Right, how they interact with earlier texts like Samuel and Kings. Plus, we will survey the scholarly debates regarding the author's identity and the dating of the text,
which is a heavily debated topic. And fourth, we'll conduct a chapter-by-chapter thematic analysis of the genealogies. We want to demonstrate how they operate as a theological argument.
Yeah, establishing that these names basically form the thesis statement of the book.
They really do.
And finally, we will close the discussion with a personal devotional section. I know the official Come Follow Me syllabus jumps ahead to the narratives of Asa and Jehoshaphat, but we are staying rigorously grounded in chapters 1 through 9 today.
Because those genealogies carry their own spiritual weight.
They absolutely do, and we will dedicate our time to them before moving forward. So to accurately read this text, we really have to reconstruct the physical and political ground it was written on.
Yeah, we do. The Jerusalem of the chronicler is situated roughly a century and a half after the Babylonian exile ended.
So we are deep into the Persian administration at this point.
Exactly. And it is necessary to state clearly that this is not the sprawling, economically dominant kingdom of David and Solomon. This is the Persian province of Yehud.
And the geography and demographics dictate the reality of daily life there, right?
Absolutely. Yehud is a small, impoverished strip of hill country. It spans barely 25 miles across.
Wow, 25 miles.
I mean, it's tiny. If we look at the demographic reconstructions from Charles Carter and, subsequent archaeological surveys, the data indicates that the entire province holds only a few tens of thousands of people.
That is a stark contrast to a sprawling kingdom.
Right. In the broader context of the Persian Empire, which, remember, stretches all the way from India to Egypt, Yehud is administratively and economically marginal.
So the physical reality of the capital city obviously reflects that marginalization.
Yes. The temple, which was rebuilt under the leadership of Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua around 516 BCE, is a demonstrably modest structure.
This was following the decree of Cyrus, right?
Correct. And the historical accounts in Ezra actually note that those older members of the community, the ones who have seen Solomon's temple, they wept at the sight of this rebuilt version.
Because it was just so much smaller.
Exactly. And for a significant period, Jerusalem itself remains unwalled.
So you have a small agrarian population living in a heavily exposed capital city.
That's the reality. And we should detail the geopolitical pressure this creates. The physical vulnerability is really compounded by their neighbors.
Right, because this tiny province is boxed in by groups who are politically antagonistic to the claims of the returnees.
Precisely. To the north, you have Samaria, and they are administered by officials like Sanballat, who view an independent Jerusalem as a direct threat to their regional influence.
And then you have the Ammonites and Arabs pressing in from the east and south, right?
Yeah, and the traditional Edomite territory to the south is now occupied by desert tribes. So that pushes the Edomites into the Negev, closer to Yehud's borders.
It sounds like a highly pressured environment, both militarily and economically.
It was a pressure cooker.
Well, when we examine this physical marginalization, it forces an inquiry into the internal psychology of the community. Like, what does this sustained vulnerability actually do to their sense of identity?
It generates a slow-burning crisis over who legitimately constitutes Israel.
Because there are competing claims.
Right. We see distinct groups operating with competing claims to the land and the covenant. There are the returnees, the descendants of those deported to Babylon who arrived back in waves under Sheshbazzar, Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah.
And they claim direct pre-exilic continuity.
Yeah, they generally view themselves as the pure remnant, but they are returning to a land that was not entirely empty.
Right. They clash with the populations who never left during the Babylonian deportation.
Exactly. The poor classes who remained and worked the land for 70 years. Plus, you have people of northern descent who are claiming their own ancient lineage.
And this is not merely an abstract theological debate about purity, is it? The practical stakes under Persian rule are pretty immediate.
Oh, very immediate. Under Persian imperial policy, subject peoples were often granted a fair amount of latitude for internal, religious, and legal administration.
As long as they paid their tribute and maintained order, presumably.
Right, exactly. Therefore, proving one's legitimacy within the recognized community dictates a lot of things. It dictates who has access to the temple, who holds priestly or Levitical office.
Who has the legal right to claim specific parcels of agricultural land?
Yes. And what one's tax status is under the empire. In an agrarian economy where land is scarce and heavily contested, genealogy functions as legal currency.
So we can visualize the scribal circle working in Jerusalem under these exact conditions.
Yeah, you have to picture them gathering whatever fragmentary surviving archives they can actually find.
Right. They have priestly rosters, older king lists, and remnants of administrative records that survived the destruction of 586 BCE.
And their specific task is immense. They're trying to trace all of humanity, beginning with Adam, and systematically narrow the focus down to the exact families currently standing in the small, contested province of Yehud.
They are essentially writing a marginal community into an empire's worth of ancestral promise that they currently have no political power to enforce.
That historical and sociological setting really dictates everything about how the text functions.
Which allows us to pivot from the narrative setting to the analytical questions raised by the text itself. The core structural anomaly here is the opening of the book.
Right, the 9 chapters of names.
Exactly. The writer begins a sweeping national history with 9 chapters of names. What theological work does genealogy accomplish that a traditional historical narrative simply cannot achieve?
Well, to answer the question of the genealogies, we really first must address a secondary technical question, which is, what is this writer's relationship to pre-existing scripture?
We need to define the exact literary nature of the writer and the text before we analyze the theology of the names themselves.
Precisely. Let's start with the titles assigned to the book because they illustrate ancient reception history. The Hebrew title is Divrei Hayamim.
Which translates to the events of the times, or the words the days, right?
Right. It suggests an annalistic record. But the Septuagint, the Greek translation produced in Alexandria, assigns it the title Paralipomena.
Which means the things left out, or the things passed over.
Exactly. And the Greek title is instructive because it reveals how early Greek-speaking readers categorized the text.
They viewed Chronicles merely as a supplement to the books of Samuel and Kings.
Right. They read it as an appendix designed to basically fill in historical gaps that the earlier writers missed or chose to omit.
But the idea of mere supplementation breaks down when you examine the deliberate large-scale omissions the chronicler makes.
It really does. The writer is not just adding details. He is actively excising major portions of the Davidic narrative.
For example, the entire Bathsheba affair is absent.
Completely absent. And the subsequent narrative of Amnon and Tamar is missing. Absalom's violent revolt, which dominates the latter half of 2 Samuel, is completely excised.
Right, so this is not a writer filling in gaps. This is an editor making structural choices about what to exclude, all to shape a specific portrait of the monarchy.
And that editorial process brings us to Michael Fishbane's concept of interbiblical exegesis.
Which is a crucial framework for this text.
It is. Fishbane demonstrated that later biblical writers actively interpreted and reworked earlier scripture into new compositions. They did not passively receive texts.
They engaged them, reshaped them, and turned them into new theological arguments.
Exactly. And Chronicles is probably the most transparent example of this process in the Hebrew Bible.
Because we possess the source material, Samuel and Kings, we can place it directly alongside Chronicles and observe the editorial mechanics line by line.
We can see exactly what they changed.
But I want to pause on the idea of ideological editing here. When we observe variations between Chronicles and the text of Samuel, how do we establish a methodological boundary?
What do you mean?
Well, we cannot simply assume every change is a theological edit if the chronicler was, say, working from a variant manuscript.
Oh, right. That is a necessary methodological caution. We can look to the work of text critics like Frank Moore Cross and P. Colin McCarter on this issue.
What did they find?
Well, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, specifically the fragments designated as 4Q Sam, scholars noticed something really significant.
In certain passages, the text of Chronicles aligns with these Qumran fragments, or with the Greek Septuagint, standing against the standard Masoretic text of Samuel that we have today.
Yes, and this indicates that the chronicler occasionally utilized a different Hebrew vorlage, a different base text of Samuel than the one that eventually became standard.
So when a reader sees a discrepancy between a verse in 2 Samuel and the parallel verse in 1 Chronicles, it might not be the chronicler intentionally rewriting history.
Right. He might have been faithfully copying a version of Samuel that's simply read differently than the version we inherited.
Okay, so not every textual difference is an ideological edit.
Precisely. Sometimes it is purely a matter of textual criticism, reflecting a divergent manuscript tradition. We have to do the careful work of separating the textual variants from the deliberate theological arguments.
And once we isolate those deliberate editorial choices, we are led into the authorship debate, specifically the historical connection between Chronicles and the books of Ezra and Nehemiah.
Which is a long history of debate.
Yeah, for listeners familiar with older commentaries, they might recall a long-standing assumption that these books were written by the same person, traditionally identified as Ezra.
Right. And the history of modern scholarship on this is quite specific.
Yeah.
In 1832, Leopold Zunz established a consensus that a single author wrote Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah.
This was based on the shared late biblical Hebrew style, wasn't it?
That and the overlapping ending, where 2 Chronicles concludes with Cyrus's decree allowing the Jews to return, which is the exact same text that opens Ezra chapter 1.
Right, and Zunz's consensus held firmly for over a century. But a major paradigm shift occurred in the late 1960s.
Yes. In 1968, Sarah Jaffet published an article in Vetus Testamentum that systematically reevaluated the linguistic and theological evidence.
She documented distinct differences in how the texts operate, which had just been previously overlooked or minimized.
Yeah, she pointed out several theological and linguistic divergences that really dismantle that single author idea.
What were the specific discrepancies she identified?
Well, for example, Chronicles and Ezra-Nehemiah display entirely different attitudes toward intermarriage.
Right. Ezra is fiercely opposed to it, initiating mass divorces.
Exactly. Whereas Chronicles includes genealogies with foreign marriages without narrative condemnation.
That's a huge shift in posture.
It is. They also have differing theological views on the Davidic monarchy. Chronicles is highly focused on David and the temple, while Ezra-Nehemiah largely moves past the monarchy to focus on the priesthood and the law.
They also display distinct postures regarding the northern tribes, don't they?
Yes, Chronicles is quite eager to include them genealogically, while Ezra-Nehemiah emphasizes strict separation from the peoples of the land.
So scholars such as H.G.M. Williamson and Gary Knoppers subsequently built on Japheth's findings, solidifying the modern consensus of separate authorship.
They did. That is where the field stands today.
But if the modern consensus points to separate authorship, how does scholarship explain the overlapping text of Cyrus's decree at the end of Chronicles and the beginning of Ezra?
It is currently explained either as a later redactional stitching, so perhaps by a scribe seeking to connect the scrolls within the canon to ensure a continuous historical reading from Adam through the Persian period, or as evidence that both independent authors were drawing on a shared administrative source text regarding Cyrus's decree.
I see. Now, I want to explicitly signal a boundary here regarding the consensus of interbiblical exegesis. While direct literary dependence of Chronicles upon Samuel and Kings is the strong majority view, we must acknowledge Graham Old's minority position.
Right, Old's work is important to mention.
Old has argued that Chronicles and Samuel independently expanded a shared, shorter source text rather than Chronicles directly editing our current version of Samuel.
He suggests both texts grew in parallel from a common ancestor.
We note this just to ensure the contours of the active academic debate are clear, even as we operate primarily within the consensus view for our analysis today.
It is a valid academic scene to name. Regardless of the precise mechanics of textual dependence, we do need to establish the dating and the rhetorical posture of the final text.
And in the internal dating evidence is primarily located in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, which lists the royal genealogy of David.
Right, because the list continues past Zerubbabel, who was the governor during the initial return, for several generations.
Depending on how one calculates the generational gaps, this places the final composition of the text in the 4th century BCE, well into the late Persian or even early Hellenistic period.
And Isaac Kalimi observes that this timeline is analytically significant.
How so?
Well, by the 4th century, this is no longer crisis literature. It's not written in the immediate raw aftermath of the return from exile, like we might see in parts of Isaiah or Ezekiel.
Right. Kalimi calls this constitutional literature.
Exactly. It reflects a community whose early survival anxieties have settled, which allows them to construct a confident, mature theological argument for their ongoing existence and their institutional structures.
We can also contextualize this literary form regionally. John Van Seters points out that the chronicler was not writing in a vacuum.
No, not at all. If you look at Greece during this era, you have Herodotus writing his histories. In Babylon, Berossus is compiling accounts. In Egypt, Manetho is active.
So writing universal histories that trace unbroken lineages back to antiquity in order to assert cultural or political legitimacy under imperial rule was a recognized genre choice across the ancient Near East during this era.
It was very much in the air.
Because the writer is a deliberate exegete operating with constitutional confidence within a recognized regional genre, we really must read these opening genealogies as a heavily engineered theological foundation.
Which brings us directly into our thematic analysis of the genealogies as a theological argument.
Beginning with the architecture of Chapter 1, the chapter begins with a single word, standing alone, Adam.
The structure of Chapter 1 operates as a funnel. It begins with the entirety of universal humanity from Adam to Noah.
It acknowledges near relatives, tracing the descendants of Ishmael and Esau, and then it systematically narrows its focus specifically to Israel and his 12 sons.
And there is a formal literary connection to Genesis operating here. The writer compresses the Genesis Toledat formula.
Right, the recurring structural phrase, these are the generations of, that organizes the book of Genesis.
Exactly. By utilizing this specific genealogical framework, the writer formally signals that Chronicles is continuing the Torah's foundational project.
It takes the architectural spine of Israel's oldest text and extends it into the post-exilic present.
And from that universal foundation, the text moves to the tribes in Chapter 2. But it introduces an immediate disruption of birth order.
Because rather than beginning with Reuben, who is historically the firstborn, the text places Judah, the fourth son, first, and dedicates 3 full chapters, chapters 2 through 4, to his lineage.
And the structural focus on Judah is obviously driven by the Davidic line. Chapter 3 traces David's lineage entirely through the period of the kings, past the 586 BCE destruction of Jerusalem, and squarely into the Persian period.
Multiple generations past Zerubbabel.
Yes. So if we move from the established scholarship to our own interpretive synthesis of this data, we can identify the theological argument the writer is constructing.
Which is that the physical monarchy has ended, the reigning king is gone, but the genealogical line has not been broken.
Right. The text is asserting that the Davidic covenant remains valid. It is dormant, perhaps awaiting future activation, but it has not been falsified by the absence of a physical throne.
That's a powerful claim. While the theological argument is structured and deliberate, the text itself contains distinct areas of untidiness, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. When we examine the Caleb genealogies in Chapter 2, we encounter overlapping and divergent source materials that just do not harmonize smoothly.
The lineages double back on themselves and present varying accounts of Caleb's descendants and their geographical settlements.
Yeah, and scholars like Rolf Klein and Simon de Vries have analyzed this. They noted that the writer leaves these disparate traditions unresolved on the page.
Rather than smoothing them out into a single, clean administrative line, the chronicler preserves the variance.
Right. This tells us something important about the writer's method.
An exegete who is willing to aggressively reshape narrative in later chapters, like cutting out entire segments of David's life, is, in certain places, remarkably conservative with untidy received records.
The writer respects the fragments of tradition enough to include them, even when they disrupt the administrative cleanliness of the text.
The preservation of the ancestral names themselves seems to hold a higher priority than narrative consistency in these chapters.
That focus on institutional structure and preservation is further evident in the central placement and disproportionate space given to Levi in Chapter 6.
As we discussed earlier, scholars like Knoppers infer from this heavy emphasis that the author, or the scribal circle responsible for the text, likely belonged to a Levitical guild.
Possibly temple musicians or singers, yeah. What the text is doing here is planting temple singers and priestly lines directly into the ancient genealogy.
Tracing them back to the origins of the tribe.
Exactly. This preloads institutional legitimacy.
So before the temple is even constructed in the subsequent narrative of David and Solomon, the personnel required to operate it are already genealogically established as an integral part of Israel's inherited architecture.
It's brilliant structurally. We also see the text working in different registers depending on the tribe.
Right. When we examine Reuben and Gad in Chapter 5, the writer embeds an explicit moral verdict regarding their historical fate.
The genealogy basically pauses to attribute their deportation by the Assyrian Empire directly to their unfaithfulness to the God of their fathers.
It is not merely a list of names. It is a theological commentary on historical exile.
Yes. We also must address the legal dimension of these lists for the tribes settling in Yehud. Relying on Nopers again, we understand that in this province, genealogy functioned as legal and administrative land claims.
Because when returnees were disputing agricultural plots with those who had remained in the land, a documented genealogical connection to the pre-exilic owners was a functional legal document in the Persian provincial courts.
Exactly. It was proof of ownership.
But despite this crucial administrative function, there are glaring omissions in the tribal lists.
Very noticeable ones. The tribe of Dan is essentially missing, save for one possible obscure reference.
And Zebulun receives no treatment whatsoever in the genealogies.
No, nothing. We must insist on leaving this as an unresolved textual problem. There is no fully satisfying scholarly explanation for their absence.
It could be due to textual loss in transmission over centuries, or perhaps the chronicler just lacked access to records for those specific tribes.
Right. We shouldn't offer an artificial harmonization where the text provides none.
But the structuring of the tribes, both in their inclusion and their omission, leads directly into the most functionally significant inclusions in the record, which we will address in our next section.
Which brings us to the tension of the northern tribes. The text includes detailed lineages for Ephraim, Manasseh, Naphtali, Asher, and Issachar.
This is a deliberate choice, despite the historical reality that the northern kingdom of Israel was completely destroyed by Assyria in 722 BCE, centuries before this text was compiled.
Exactly. So if we synthesize this detail, we see an impending narrative tension. Genealogically, the text explicitly affirms all Israel as a 12-tribe theological category.
The chronicler ensures they are counted.
Yes. However, when we read the ensuing narrative in the later chapters, the text will almost entirely silence the northern kings.
The history of the divided monarchy is told almost exclusively from the perspective of Judah.
Right. So as readers, you are required to hold both realities simultaneously without forcing a resolution.
The genealogy operates in an expansive, inclusive register, maintaining the ideal of 12 tribes, while the later narrative operates in a space of strict theological judgment, focusing on the legitimate throne in Jerusalem.
And that expansive genealogical framing really culminates in chapter 9. This chapter provides a detailed list of the post-exilic residents of Jerusalem.
There is a complex text-critical relationship between this chapter and Nehemiah 11, which contains a similar, though not identical, list of city residents.
Scholars heavily debate which list is prior, or if both draw on a shared Persian period administrative census.
But regardless of the source precedents, the focus in chapter 9 rests heavily on the gatekeepers.
Ralph Klein notes that this section functions as a charter document for the restored community.
It ends the sweeping genealogical sequence, which began with Adam, with the specific families entrusted to guard the threshold of sacred space in the present day, controlling access to the rebuilt temple.
Drawing on the work of Gary Knoppers and Ehud Ben Zvi, we can understand these genealogies as maps of belonging and, conversely, maps of exclusion.
Because in an environment where resources, land, and identity are fiercely contested, recovering these names functions as an act of literal restoration for a traumatized community whose physical records were burned in the Babylonian conquest.
By reconstructing the names, the text makes a concrete argument that the covenant survived the historical catastrophe.
I want to look closely at one specific detail in chapter 3 regarding the Davidic line. When listing David's descendants, Solomon's mother is named Bathshua, daughter of Ammiel, rather than Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, as she is known in 2 Samuel.
That's a really notable shift.
We must acknowledge this might be a variant tradition circulating independently, or just a linguistic shift in naming conventions.
Sure, that's possible.
However, its effect aligns perfectly with the total omission of the Bathsheba adultery narrative later in the book. It demonstrates that even the supposedly neutral lists of names participate in the overarching editorial posture of the text.
Right, by removing the name Bathsheba, the text removes the immediate linguistic trigger to David's great sin.
It is a structurally complex observation regarding the effect of the text, regardless of whether we can definitively prove the writer's conscious intent to obscure the name.
Yeah, that's a fair way to frame it. We should also briefly cover the administrative reality embedded in sections like chapters 5 and 7.
The military census function.
Exactly. The text repeatedly lists the numbers of mighty men of valor and men fit for war. These lists double as a military census.
They are doing state formation work on paper for a community that is presently stateless and subservient to Persia, maintaining a record of fighting strength as a core part of their ancestral identity.
It's a way of asserting sovereignty, even just textually.
Well, this concludes our scholarly analysis. We have established that the names themselves are the thesis statement of Chronicles. They establish legitimacy, assert continuity, map the boundaries of the community, and argue for the permanence of the Davidic and Levitical covenants.
They do a tremendous amount of theological work.
They really do. And we are now going to shift our register. We are transitioning from rigorous textual scholarship to faithful reflection.
Which is important for these texts.
As we noted at the beginning, while the official Come Follow Me reading skips ahead, there is profound devotional weight in these 9 chapters of names that warrants our attention, particularly for Latter-day Saints who are deeply invested in the theology of record-keeping.
When we examine the chronicler's instinct to preserve and connect these generations, there is an immediate theological connection to the theology of the Restoration, specifically Doctrine and Covenants 128.
In that epistle, Joseph Smith utilized the language of Malachi, discussing the turning of the hearts of the children to the fathers.
Right. He articulated the theological concept that restoring a severed record is fundamentally a spiritual act. It is the process of welding the human family into a connected chain, reaching back to Adam.
That specific theological vision, outlined in Nauvoo, mirrors the exact literary shape and function of 4 Chronicles 1.
It's the same impulse.
We can also observe a direct parallel to the Book of Mormon, specifically 1 Nephi 5. Lehi's family is displaced, facing the permanent loss of their homeland and their institutional structures in Jerusalem.
And the urgency they feel to secure the brass plates and the danger they are willing to face to get them is directly tied to preserving their genealogy.
The Persian period returnees compiling Chronicles are engaged in the exact same work. They're securing their memory against the threat of imperial erasure.
This highlights a shared human impulse, validated by Scripture, to preserve identity and ancestral connection at great cost during times of intense displacement.
We can also reflect on what we might call the theology of the lost, looking back at the genealogies of the northern tribes.
The inclusion of Ephraim, Manasseh, and the others is highly instructive devotionally.
Because the North was politically and practically gone, they were not contributing to the rebuilding of Yehud. They had been scattered centuries prior.
Yet the chronicler counted them as fully belonging to the 12-tribe structure of Israel. This text pushes back gently against finality.
And that principle applies directly to families today. Many have family members who feel relationally, politically, or spiritually lost to the core community.
Right. The text suggests that being lost to the present arrangement of things is not the same as being erased from God's record.
The chronicler held a space for them in the text, preserving their names in the hope of a future restoration of all Israel.
This touches on the universal human fear of being forgotten. The chronicler answered a traumatized, marginalized community not with abstract theology about the nature of God, but with specific names of people doing specific jobs in specific places.
The names assert that these lives mattered and were recorded.
They push back against erasure.
We see this instinct inherited in the New Testament, too. Matthew opens his gospel with a genealogy, employing the exact same structural argument as the chronicler to connect Jesus Christ to David and Abraham.
The conviction here is that specific named history is the actual vehicle through which God works.
It is not an administrative distraction. It is the theological point. God operates through generations of real, flawed people.
Yeah.
Whatever is broken, missing, or untidy in your own family line, the God who preserved 9 chapters of unremarkable names in 1 Chronicles is not indifferent to yours. That is our foundation. These names set the stage for the narrative. Next time, we will move into 1 Chronicles 10 through 29, focusing on the idealized version of David, what gets left out, and why. Until then.